Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how I did this pastel drawing of a sea turtle. Now as always I like to do my backgrounds first, and I'm actually going to have that section of this portrait coming up in a separate video here on YouTube where I can focus on how to use pan pastels to create this really soft gradient from one colour to the next. But onto the sea turtle, and a lot of this portrait was about breaking up each section to make sure that it didn't become overwhelming. There's quite a few different patterns and textures that are required here, and working on too much of a larger area I feel can actually overcomplicate that. So what I like to do is break it up into small manageable sections so that it is far easier to approach. Now when I started with my base foundation, I'm initially focusing on the main lights and darks and also those vibrant colours. Now I find that this makes the layering process much easier because I don't want to be focusing on the high levels of detail at that stage. One of the wonderful things about working with pastels is that we can continue to layer those light and dark variations on top of our base foundation. So by breaking this up into one layer at a time, it's really helping to simplify that process and prevent it from becoming as overwhelming. Now when I have a vibrant colour, I'm going to have that in place first. Now I've got a video here on YouTube of a red fox, I've also got a toucan, and all of those are showing how to incorporate the vibrant colours initially in that base layer and then adjust them as we go before we start building in our details to get the right balance of colour saturation and vibrancy and also good contrast. By adjusting the way that we are using the pencils throughout this layering process from subject to subject is going to really help get the very best out of this medium. Now another thing with the flexibility of pastels and how we can layer different colours on top of each other, it means then that breaking up more complex patterns like this does also become easier. Now there are many different ways to get to the same end, but for something like this I found by focusing just purely on those initial shapes and then as I am here adjusting the colour separately, then working with my details, reinforcing my lighting, it means then that again I'm able to focus on one layer at a time. Now because of that potential of the pastels mixing in with various layers underneath, we do need to give some consideration as to what colour we use first, and this of course is going to also depend on the reference photo. Now for example here, I'm usually typically working with a light to dark approach just to make sure that I don't end up with the lighter or whiter sections being too muddy. Now when I work with a darker colour, I will want to be making sure that I've got good contrast of course, so therefore my darker colours will usually be established first. This is where we need to be looking at that reference photo and judging each small section individually. Now by making sure here that I've incorporated my lighter colours first and then darken it in stages, it means then that I've got those lighter highlights as bright as I can possibly have them. I always then have that option of darkening them later if I need to. Now as you can see here, as I'm starting to build up more of this texture and detailing, this could definitely be very confusing. But by first of all working on the base foundation first and then adding in that detail, it really does just help to simplify that process. Now the shell portion of this drawing is a great example of that. Initially here on the top section, I'm going to be working with a light to dark approach. I'm starting with more of a light pink base and then I'm going to gradually increase that contrast in stages. Now one other aspect here that was important for this texture was the smooth blending. I didn't want any harsh start and stop points apart from that inner lighter line that separates each shape. Whereas the main bulk of those sections of the shell, I wanted to capture that softness to make it look like it was more curved over, and then I could add my detail. Now this is one of those textures where that shinier surface, having that smooth blend in place first, can also add more of that depth, shape and form. And one of my priorities here was to make it look like it was able to curve over and away from the viewer. Now by capturing the accurate lighting where it is lighter on the top portion and then darker more towards the neck, this is going to help with that additional level of three-dimensional look to the drawing. So here when I start working with more of a darker brown, I then continue to darken that layer adding some black before I come back in and work with my highlights. Now, one thing here that's really important is not to add highlights where they shouldn't be. So on this section here where the colours are much darker, I do of course have some lighter details, but it's not anything that's overly bright. This is what's going to help capture more of that realism and the shape that I've just mentioned. Now, it is very easy that when we start adding in these highlights, they do make a big difference. They can have a big impact. But then overdoing that, we're going to be changing the lighting. So making sure that I'm not adding random shadows and highlights where they shouldn't be is a key part of any drawing. Now, this next section is another great example of a difficult texture that can be simplified by using the right approach. So first of all, I've used a mixture of green and black to give me a good base foundation and hint at the colour that I wanted. Once that's then done, I can work with refining the detail. I can add some of those darker creases, I can add some highlights, and gradually with each layer that's built up on top, I start to create more of that realism. Whereas if I'd have started to draw the detail first and then try to add in the colour, I'm going to more likely get confused with that layering process. Working on building up a good base foundation initially is a key part of any of my drawings. Now, this area here is another example of that. First of all, I want to be making sure that I don't have any harsh start and stop points between those sections, and really blend in and soften in those edges to make sure that I don't have anything that is harsh. Now, once I've got that softness in place, again, this is the same concept. I've built up the colour first and then I'm going to be adding my details. This is another complex texture with a few different creases, highlights and ridges that could very much become complicated in this drawing process. But by focusing on the initial colour first, whether or not it should be a lighter approach or a darker approach, has really helped with this section as well. Now, the level of detail that is included in a portrait like this is very much going to depend on each artist's personal preference, how much of that realism they're looking to capture, and also the size of the artwork. Now, this was 8 by 16 inches, so it was a fairly longer portrait than what I would typically do, but because it wasn't that high, I still had to be realistic with how much detail I could include, given that the background of this took up just as much as the subject. Now, if I was to do this on a much larger scale, then I'd have even more room to add more detail. But working on really big portraits like that, although the level of realism can be increased, they also take significantly longer. So it's always important to make sure that depending on your goals for that portrait, the size of the artwork, that the right amount of time is allocated. Now, with the level of realism for this, and this is especially more noticeable on this complex section of the portrait, is having something that is too small is going to make this kind of pattern very fiddly and therefore more stressful. Now, it's one of the reasons why I decided to do this 16 inches long, because I had the composition in mind that I wanted to use, but I wanted to also make sure that I had enough room that I could hint at a high level of realism without working too big. Now, I also knew that with the level of realism intended here, that I had to work with the correct approach in order to maximise the space that I had. Now, what I mean by that is, as you can see, I've come in with a white pencil to hint at some of those areas around these darker shapes. Rather than blocking in all of this with white and then adding the darker shapes to it, I've decided to work with a bit more of a careful approach to make sure that I've got my contrast just right. Now, technically, with that benefit of being able to mix these layers with pastel pencils, I could have used a lighter layer for the entire base and then come back in with my darker pastel pencils to put in these shapes and these tile patterns. But what that would have done is potentially meant that the darker colours that I am adding here would then have a foggy look to them because they are naturally picking up more of that lighter pastel. It would of course mix in with that as these colours are added on top. Whereas here, when I am working with more of those larger shapes, I did use my darker pencils first, get those in place, and then for these smaller shapes I can add them over the top of my lighter base foundation. And this again is another example of how I feel pastel pencils has made this potentially very confusing section of the portrait much easier because of how we can break up that layering process. Now, by using this approach, I've been able to maximise the contrast. My darker shapes here are as dark as they need to be, and I've also got those lighter gaps in between as bright as they should be. This just means that that area there has that level of realism because those values are right. Now, this section of the drawing is the same regarding the layering technique that I have used here. This is light to dark, but I am using my pastel pencils to create a little bit more softness. Now, this is something that I love to do with the pastel pencils, as I feel that I have more control with how much of that layer I am softening. I don't want to overblend here, so the pastel pencils are also a great way of achieving a very unique level of softness, which I feel can make a big difference to the level of realism. Now, of course, blending tools can be used, soft tools, eye makeup applicators, cotton buds, whatever it may be, but I do find that some of those, depending on the amount of pastel that you've got on your paper, it can actually push that pastel around rather than blend or soften. They can also overblend very quickly as well. So where I do want to have more of that control, maybe adjust that level of softness in stages, working with the pencil technique here as I am currently, especially for my base layers, can be really effective. And one thing that I want to mention as well is no matter what layer or what section I'm working on, I'm not trying to look at that reference photo and get every single detail in exactly the right place. Now, if I was working larger, then that is something that I would be focusing more on. But what I want to be doing here instead is getting it as accurate as I can without that stress of making sure that it all has to be exactly spot on. Now, when working on these slightly smaller drawings compared to something that is massive, we're not able to add in each tiny detail, but we can still make it look like we've drawn all of that by getting the lighting right, that contrast is crucial, and making sure there's enough of that indicated texture. I don't want to just do a few pencil strokes and it not really hint at anything at all, and then also take it to the other extreme, add too many details for the size of the portrait or the area that I'm working on, and then cover up too much of my base layers. Because as I've mentioned so many times here, the base layers are helping with that level of realism. If I cover them up completely with too much detail, then this kind of layering process, it starts to become not as relevant. Each layer I'm looking to add should be enhancing that depth, adjusting the contrast, making it look more realistic, without having that desire to add in more detail just for the sake of it. Now, this is something that I do cover thoroughly in my real-time tutorials. I love adding in lots of detail, but it can certainly be overdone, which is one consideration, as I say, with the size of the artwork. Now, that's also why I like to work in small sections rather than whole individual layers. I do feel that if I was to work in whole individual layers, I'm probably going to skip out on these crucial techniques and more of those valuable layers, especially at those mid stages. They provide so much additional depth that working in these smaller areas just means I can give each section the right amount of time that it deserves. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in drawing along to the real-time version of this tutorial, then all of the information to that is linked in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.